And consent dividends in general are dividends you make in the year after, or you kind of determine you need to make them after the year has passed. So that's just sort of a general thing that's out there to allow REITs to make their dividend requirement in a subsequent year.
Joining me today is Martina Linders, partner with RSM U.S. Martina, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Matt.
Now, you formerly worked for a REIT and have been with an accounting firm for some time now. What are some of the surprising traps for the unwary REIT qualification failures that you have seen over the last few years?
Sure. Well, luckily for me, I haven't really seen anything that can't be fixed. So in the current regime that's out there, there's almost always a way to get out of it. So that's the good news. Secondly, I find that REIT people are extremely diligent. And so usually they're trying to catch things before they happen. But certainly there are a couple, and really just even new things that have come up for me in the last couple of years that I thought I would mention. So the first is that REITs are supposed to distribute 90% of their taxable income in order to maintain REIT status. And typically most REITs will distribute 100% because if they don't distribute the full amount, they still have to pay income tax. But sometimes if you're a REIT and you have like a net operating loss, they're going to say, hey, well, my net operating losses exceed my taxable income. I can just use my net operating loss and not pay a distribution. Well, that would have been the rule prior to 2018, but to the extent you have net operating losses that have been incurred since 2018, they're actually limited to 80% of your taxable income. So it's not going to wipe out your full taxable income, and so you're still going to have a portion of that REIT taxable income that you have to distribute in order to maintain your REIT status. So I think that comes as a little bit of surprise if you don't exactly know when your NOLs are generated. The other thing, while it's not a REIT qualification failure, something that people fail to note is that while a net operating loss will help you, distribute all your federal taxable income, states aren't always so cooperative, and they sometimes have different rules. And so even though you may not have a federal tax if you use an NOL, frequently you still can have some state income tax exposures. The other thing that I've seen come up, and that's really almost like a 2022 issue, is that generically REITs have to identify a hedge that they enter into. So a lot of times REITs will enter into an interest rate cap or swap with respect to their mortgage interest debt that they're entering into. And so a REIT typically would want to, what we call identify, and it's really putting a note to the file, but you have to do it contemporaneously with entering into the hedge. If you do that, the good news is that if you have income from that hedge, it is not bad income, and you get to exclude it entirely from your income testing. However, if you fail to identify it, it's bad income. And I would say prior to 2022, just because of what was going on with the interest rate environment, which was basically nothing, any interest rate, these caps or swaps, they just really weren't. They're more of an insurance policy, and they didn't really have a lot of value, so they weren't creating any income. So even if you had failed to identify it, it wasn't going to create any sort of REIT income testing problem. However, you get to 2022, and I don't know, how many interest rate increases did we have during 2022? 5, 6, I don't know. I was trying to sell a house during that time, so it seemed like a lot. And so suddenly these caps became quite valuable. And so I had one client in particular sell a few of them for kind of a 7-figure sum. And so had they failed to identify it, it would have created a bad, certainly more bad income than they needed, and they would have failed the gross income test. Now, as I said earlier, the good news is that we would have been able to mitigate that through curing of it, but certainly don't want to be in that position.
What are some of the solutions that you've had to employ to address some of these REIT-related mistakes?
And again, a lot of times REITs are, since they're so diligent, a lot of times they're proactive. So to the extent you identify maybe something in the gray, you're either, you'll go to the IRS in advance and talk to them about getting a private letter ruling on sort of a discrete issue. You might work with primarily outside counsel to get an opinion on some sort of discrete issue, again, where you're sort of unsure as to what the results are. But if you find yourself in a situation where despite all your diligence, you still had a failure, a couple things that you can work on is getting a private letter ruling. It kind of depends on the issue, but I had one come up last year with respect to consent dividends, that we needed to go in and get a ruling to allow us to amend a return to take the benefit of a consent dividend. And consent dividends in general are dividends you make in the year after, or you can determine you need to make them after the year has passed. So that's just sort of a general thing that's out there to allow REITs to make their dividend requirement in a subsequent year. Also, deficiency dividends are another tool in the toolbox where now some of these come at a cost. There might be an interest charge or something like that, but it allows a REIT to kind of go back in time and make a distribution, or they make a distribution now, but they get to go back in time and apply it to the year that they need it.
And finally, what advice would you provide to those new to REITs to avoid some of these inadvertent REIT failure traps?
Two things you need to know is that can you make sure that you're going to meet the ownership tests? And this is more in the private REIT space versus public REIT space, but sometimes people will find themselves in a situation where they don't, maybe they're closely held and they don't even realize it, or there's large family groups behind it or something like that. So they can't actually meet the REIT ownership test. And then the second one is just how long do you actually expect to hold the property? Because if you're not expected to be a long-term holder, you shouldn't be in a REIT space. But once you get there, like, okay, yeah, I want to be a REIT, I know it. The thing that I would recommend most is, especially particularly for tax people, and I'm a tax person, is make sure that the tax team is well integrated with your acquisitions team and your legal team, and so that they are with you step by step in terms of, especially as you're going to buy a property, because that's really the time to identify issues. And the tax people, despite I think rumors, the tax people are not here to be deal killers. The tax people are here to help you, right? And so you want them there in advance and working with you on, looking at the property, maybe getting the property to fill out like a property service questionnaire so that you can really identify things up front versus scrambling at the end of the year. You've already bought the deal and you're trying to figure out, oh my gosh, I need to restructure this. So much better to have everybody involved early. So, that's my recommendation. Not only tax people, invite yourself to meetings, but for the legal and acquisitions team, make sure you're dragging your tax people along so you guys can all work together at making sure everything is REIT friendly.